It lasted less than a second. No warning. No countdown. No chance to reconsider. Just a sharp, violent sound that cut through the night. A gunshot. In Harlem, gunshots were not unusual. The streets had heard them before, arguments gone wrong, rivalries settled, tempers lost. But this one was different. This one carried weight. This one carried a message. Because the man who pulled the trigger wasn't acting alone. He stood behind Bumpy Johnson. And that single sound would quietly change everything. In the world Bumpy Johnson ruled, power wasn't displayed with speeches or public declarations. It was communicated through action. Through silence. Through consequences. And when those failed, through men who acted without hesitation. That night, one of those men stepped forward. Not a boss. Not a kingpin. A bodyguard. A man whose job was to stand close enough to danger that hesitation could get him killed. A man trained not to ask questions in moments where seconds mattered. A man who understood that loyalty, in Harlem's underworld, was not proven with words, but with action. The trigger was pulled at point-blank range. And the sound traveled fast. Not just down the street. Not just through Harlem. But through the invisible network of fear, respect, and reputation that defined power in the city. Within minutes, people knew something had happened. Within hours, everyone knew who it involved. Because when violence touched Bumpy Johnson's circle, it was never random. It was never emotional. It was strategic. Controlled. Deliberate. And this time, it wasn't Bumpy himself who fired the shot. That made it even more important. Because it meant the system worked. It meant Bumpy Johnson didn't need to be present to enforce his authority. His influence moved through the people around him, men who knew exactly what was expected when a line was crossed. This wasn't chaos. This was order, Harlem style. The question that followed wasn't who was shot. It was why. What threat was serious enough to justify immediate action? What moment pushed things past negotiation? And how did a single gunshot reshape relationships, alliances, and fear across Harlem's underworld? Tonight, we're not telling a Hollywood story. We're examining a moment. A moment where loyalty met violence. Where power was tested and confirmed. Where a bodyguard made a decision that couldn't be undone. Because history doesn't always change with laws or elections. Sometimes, it changes with a sound. A sound that tells everyone listening. This is where the line is. By the time this story unfolds, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a symbol. A place where black culture, ambition, struggle, and survival collided every single day. Jazz spilled out of nightclubs. Churches filled on Sundays. Street corners carried news faster than newspapers. And beneath it all ran an underground economy that kept Harlem alive when the rest of the city looked away. At the center of that underground world stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem by force alone. His power came from understanding balance. He knew when to apply pressure and when to remove it. When to intimidate and when to protect. And most importantly, he knew that chaos was bad for business. Harlem in the 1930s through the 1950s lived under constant strain. Racism limited opportunity. Police presence often meant harassment rather than protection. Jobs were scarce. Housing was overcrowded. And when legitimate systems failed, people built their own. That's where men like Bumpy Johnson rose. He controlled the numbers racket, an illegal lottery that quietly became one of the largest sources of income in Harlem. For many residents, it wasn't just gambling, it was survival. Money from the numbers paid rent, fed families, and funded businesses when banks refused loans. But Bumpy's control went beyond money. He enforced rules. Violence against innocent people was not tolerated. Random chaos brought police attention, and police attention threatened everyone. Disputes were handled quietly. Outsiders were warned. Repeat offenders were dealt with. That kind of discipline earned Bumpy something rare in the underworld: community support. People didn't see him as just a gangster. They saw him as a protector, or at least the lesser evil in a system stacked against them. But power like that came with constant threats. Rival gangs wanted territory. Outside mobsters wanted a piece of Harlem's profits. And law enforcement watched closely, waiting for an excuse to strike. That's why Bumpy never worked alone. Around him was a carefully chosen inner circle: drivers, messengers, enforcers, and bodyguards. These were not reckless men. They were trusted men. Men who understood that one mistake could bring down everything Bumpy had built. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, power wasn't loud. It was felt. You didn't need to see him on every corner. You just needed to know he existed. That his reach extended beyond his physical presence. That even when he wasn't there, his rules still applied. And that's what made the bodyguard's action so significant. Because when the trigger was pulled, it wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was the extension of Bumpy Johnson's authority. A reminder that Harlem had an order and that order would be defended. In the world Bumpy Johnson lived in, a bodyguard was more than protection. He was a filter between chaos and order. A bodyguard didn't just block bullets. He absorbed risk. He made decisions in seconds that could alter lives, alliances, and reputations. And once a decision was made, there was no appeal, no review, no second chance. For Bumpy Johnson, choosing a bodyguard wasn't about size or aggression. It was about judgment. The wrong man would panic. The wrong man would hesitate. The wrong man would act emotionally. And emotion was dangerous. Bumpy's bodyguards were expected to understand the environment before anyone else did. They read rooms. They watched hands. They listened to tone. They noticed who stood too close, who spoke out of turn, who lingered longer than necessary. Because threats didn't always arrive with weapons drawn. Sometimes they arrived smiling. A bodyguard's presence sent a message long before violence ever occurred. Standing beside Bumpy Johnson wasn't just about being seen, it was about being understood. It told everyone watching that Bumpy was not alone, not exposed, and not vulnerable. But there was another side to the job that few people talked about. A bodyguard had authority to act. In moments where danger appeared suddenly, there was no time to ask Bumpy what to do. The expectation was clear: protect the structure. Protect the man. Protect the balance. That meant the bodyguard carried not just a weapon, but permission. Permission earned through trust. Trust earned over years. And trust that, once given, came with a heavy cost. Because if a bodyguard acted when he shouldn't, the consequences were severe. Acting too early could start a war. Acting too late could end a life. Every movement was weighed against outcomes no one could fully predict. That's why Bumpy Johnson's inner circle was small. Each man was chosen carefully. Loyalty mattered, but loyalty alone wasn't enough. Intelligence mattered. Discipline mattered. Silence mattered. A good bodyguard knew when not to act just as much as when to act. And that's what made the moment we're examining so significant. When the trigger was pulled at point-blank range, it wasn't the act of a reckless gunman. It was the action of someone who believed, in that exact second, that there was no other option left. That belief didn't come from anger. It came from responsibility. Responsibility to prevent a larger conflict. Responsibility to enforce boundaries. Responsibility to make a decision no one else wanted to make. In Harlem's Underworld, violence was never supposed to be random. It was meant to be final, controlled, and understood. And when a bodyguard crossed that line, it meant something had already gone wrong long before the trigger was pulled. This wasn't about ego. It was about containment. Because sometimes, one decisive action prevented 10 more violent ones. And sometimes, the man who fired the shot carried that weight alone, knowing history would remember the sound, but never fully understand the moment. Moments before history changes are rarely dramatic. They are quiet. The air feels heavier, but no one can explain why. Conversations continue. Footsteps echo like they always have. And yet, something in the room shifts, subtle, almost invisible, signaling that the balance is about to break. This was one of those moments. The setting wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a nightclub stage or a public street filled with witnesses. It was the kind of place where business was handled privately, where words carried consequences and silence was intentional. Everyone present understood the rules. No sudden movements. No raised voices. No disrespect. But rules only matter when everyone agrees to follow them. The tension didn't come from shouting or threats. It came from posture. From distance. From the way one man stood just a little too close. From a hand that lingered too long near a coat pocket. From eyes that didn't look away when they should have. Bumpy Johnson was calm. He always was. Years in the underworld had taught him that panic was weakness. He spoke evenly, moved slowly, and never allowed his emotions to surface in public. To outsiders, that calm looked like confidence. To those who knew him well, it was something else entirely. It was calculation. His bodyguard stood nearby, silent, watching everything. He noticed the things others didn't. A slight change in breathing. A shift of weight from one foot to the other. A voice that tightened when it spoke Bumpy's name. These were signals not of what someone said, but of what they were thinking. The bodyguard's mind raced through possibilities. Was this a bluff? Was this intimidation? Was this the moment violence arrived unannounced? There was no certainty. And that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing in the room. In that world, hesitation could be fatal. Waiting for confirmation often meant waiting too long. The bodyguard had been trained not formally, but through experience, to trust instinct over logic in moments like this. Instinct said something was wrong. Very wrong. The distance between men mattered now. Every inch felt deliberate. Every sound felt amplified. A chair creaked. Shoes scraped the floor. A voice lowered, not to calm the situation, but to control it. Bumpy didn't move. That, too, was a signal. When Bumpy Johnson stayed still, it meant he was measuring the situation carefully. He trusted his bodyguard to act if action was necessary. That trust had been built over time, reinforced through loyalty, silence, and survival. The bodyguard's hand hovered near his weapon. Not drawn. Not hidden. Ready. This was the moment where history balanced on instinct. There would be no warning shot. No shouted command. No dramatic countdown. Only a split second where a decision would be made. A decision that could end a threat or ignite something much larger. And then, without ceremony, without hesitation, the trigger was pulled. The sound was sharp. Not loud in the way people imagine gunfire, not a cinematic explosion, but a sudden, violent crack that cut through the air and erased everything else. 1 second there was tension. The next, there was silence. A single gunshot at point-blank range has a finality to it that cannot be undone. There is no warning, no chance for retreat, no opportunity for negotiation. It is an answer to a question no one wanted asked. The bodyguard didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. The decision had already been made before the sound ever existed. People froze. In that brief moment after the shot, time seemed to stretch. Eyes widened. Breath caught in throats. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in. No one rushed forward. No one ran. Everyone understood what had just happened. This wasn't chaos. This was enforcement. The man who fell never had time to react. There was no struggle, no dramatic exchange of words. Just the immediate consequence of crossing a line that had been drawn long before anyone entered the room. Bumpy Johnson remained still. That detail mattered. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush to explain. His calm wasn't indifference, it was control. In a world built on reputation, panic would have signaled weakness. Calm signaled authority. The bodyguard stepped back into position, weapon lowered but not holstered. The message had been delivered. And that message traveled faster than the sound of the gunshot itself. Within minutes, word spread not through newspapers, not through police reports, but through whispers. Through looks exchanged on street corners. Through phones that rang without being answered. A boundary had been enforced. The impact was immediate. Potential challengers thought twice. Rivals recalculated. Allies reassessed their positions. Not because they feared random violence, but because they understood what the shot represented. It meant that Bumpy Johnson's inner circle would act decisively when necessary. It meant that threats would not be debated endlessly. And it meant that crossing certain lines came with consequences that could not be negotiated away. The gunshot didn't start a war. It prevented one. That's the uncomfortable truth about power in the underworld. Sometimes violence, when used sparingly and deliberately, maintained order more effectively than words ever could. Law enforcement would later hear about the incident. Details would be vague. Stories would conflict. Witnesses would remember things differently if they remembered anything at all. But within Harlem's underground network, the facts were clear. Someone had miscalculated. And that miscalculation ended everything. For the bodyguard, the moment didn't end with the echo of the shot. It followed him afterward in the quiet, in the stillness, in the knowledge that he had crossed a line from protector to executioner. History would remember the sound. But only he would carry the weight of the decision. And Harlem stayed standing. Because sometimes, the most powerful messages aren't spoken. They're heard once and never forgotten. The aftermath of the gunshot didn't unfold in sirens and flashing lights. It unfolded in silence. The room was cleared quickly, methodically. No one lingered. No one asked questions. In Harlem's underground, survival depended on knowing when to leave and how much to forget. By the time the body was discovered by authorities, the moment had already passed. Whatever had happened cleanly, without witnesses willing to speak. Police reports would be thin. Leads would go nowhere. And within days, the case would quietly fade into the background like so many others from that era. But on the streets of Harlem, the impact was immediate. Word traveled fast, but carefully. People didn't speak openly about what happened. They referenced it indirectly, with looks, pauses, and half-finished sentences. Everyone understood the meaning without needing the details. The message wasn't fear. It was clarity. Rival operators adjusted their movements. Meetings were postponed. Territory disputes went unresolved, not because people suddenly became peaceful, but because no one wanted to test boundaries that had just been reinforced. Bumpy Johnson's authority didn't expand overnight. It solidified. The shooting didn't make him more violent, it made him more untouchable. Not because he pulled the trigger, but because his system worked. His people acted when they had to, and stopped when they should. That distinction mattered. In the underworld, unpredictability invites chaos. Predictable enforcement creates stability. After the incident, everyone knew exactly where the lines were. And no one crossed them. The bodyguard became a silent figure after that. He didn't boast. He didn't seek recognition. In fact, he faded further into the background. That was intentional. Attention was dangerous. Stories grew louder when people fed them. But even in silence, his reputation followed him. Not as a killer. As a line that shouldn't be crossed. For Bumpy Johnson, the aftermath required careful handling. He didn't retaliate further. He didn't issue threats. He didn't escalate. Doing nothing was the most powerful move he could make. It signaled confidence. It told everyone that the issue had been resolved, completely. And it worked. Law enforcement increased surveillance briefly, but without witnesses or evidence, there was nothing to pursue. Harlem had seen far worse violence. One quiet incident didn't justify a crackdown. Life continued. Numbers were played. Businesses opened. Music filled the clubs. Families went about their routines. To outsiders, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, everything had. The incident became a reference point, a story told without details, a lesson passed down without names. Newcomers were warned indirectly. Veterans nodded knowingly. The streets had spoken. And the sound that changed everything wasn't just the gunshot. It was the silence that followed. As years passed, the story of the gunshot changed. Details blurred. Names disappeared. Timelines shifted. Some versions grew darker, others more heroic. That's what happens when real events move into legend, they stop belonging to facts alone and start living inside memory. But at the center of every version remained the same truth. One decision. One moment. One sound that altered the balance of power in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson's legacy has always existed in contradiction. To some, he was a criminal, a man who operated outside the law and profited from illegal enterprises. To others, he was a protector, someone who filled a vacuum left by institutions that failed the community. Both perspectives are true. And that's why his story still matters. The gunshot fired by his bodyguard became symbolic not because of the violence, but because of what followed. Harlem didn't collapse. It didn't erupt into chaos. It didn't descend into open war. Instead, it stabilized. That outcome challenged simple narratives about crime and order. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. What happens when the law doesn't serve everyone equally? Who enforces rules when institutions are absent or hostile? And can order exist outside legality? Bumpy Johnson understood those questions long before historians debated them. His world demanded answers in real time, without theory or moral distance. Every decision carried consequences that rippled through lives, families, and neighborhoods. The bodyguard who pulled the trigger faded from history almost entirely. That, too, is telling. The man who acted at the most critical moment was never meant to be remembered. He was an instrument, not a symbol. The symbol was the result. And the result was stability. Over time, Harlem changed. New generations arrived. Old systems faded. Bumpy Johnson himself would eventually face prison, aging out of the world he once dominated. But the principles he operated by, restraint, calculation, loyalty, and controlled force, remained part of the neighborhood's memory. The story survives because it represents something larger than one man. It represents a community navigating survival when choices were limited. It represents leadership that existed in gray areas. And it represents the cost of power not just for the man at the top, but for those who carried out his will in moments where hesitation meant destruction. The sound of that gunshot never echoed in public records. But it echoed in behavior. In decisions not made. In wars that never started. In lives that continued uninterrupted. That's why people still talk about it. Not because it glorifies violence, but because it illustrates how fragile order can be, and how quickly everything can change when a single line is crossed. History often remembers speeches, laws, and movements. But sometimes, history turns on quieter moments. A look. A decision. A sound. And in Harlem, that sound changed everything.